Hi there, I'm Christina.
And I'm Zane.
And we work with Clean Energy Action.
And today we're going to talk to you a little bit about carbon budgets and the equity issues that come up with them. Climate scientists have done the easy part of figuring out just about how much carbon we can emit into the atmosphere without things changing too dramatically.
Humanity can only release about an additional 1,000 gigatons of CO2 if we want a decent chance of keeping global warming below 2 degrees C.
If our emissions keep growing the way they have been since the year 2000, then we're going to blow through the entire 1,000 gigaton budget by about the year 2030. 2030 sounds like the future. That's just 15 years from now. That's less far away in time than 9/11. In other words, we don't have a lot of time to deal with this problem.
Now, if only international negotiations were as simple as climate science. We know the budget. Unfortunately, the hard part is figuring out how to use it. So who gets to release the greenhouse gas emissions? How much? When? And for what purposes?
Because the overall greenhouse gas budget is a fixed amount, if one person or one country uses some of it, that means nobody else ever can.
You don't have to think about climate change in terms of emission budgets for very long to realize that a lot of what this boils down to is questions of equity.
So is it better to use some of this limited budget of emissions to generate electricity so you can run a 5,000 watt clothes dryer here in sunny, dry Colorado? Or would those same emissions and that same electricity maybe be better spent giving somebody in Bangladesh light at night so that they can read?
Should we let the countries that are already burning a lot, or have burned a lot in the past, keep burning a lot because their economies are tethered to fossil fuels? Or should we let the countries that haven't burned a lot historically play a little catch-up?
If we did split up the remaining 1,000 gigatons across the existing 7 billion people, that would mean each person would get about 140 tons worth of emissions for themselves and all of their descendants. And just for scale, that's about 7 years worth of the average American's emissions today.
Ugh, it's gross.
In the long run, what we want to do is give everybody access to energy or energy services that don't involve any greenhouse gases. But in the short term, most of the energy we use does come from fossil fuels. And remember, if we keep doing what we've been doing, we will burn the entire budget in the next 15 years.
So equity between countries is not the only thing we have to address. There's also intergenerational equity. That's equity between the past, the present, and the future. When we use up our emissions budgets now, that means that it's not available for our children or our grandchildren in the later half of the century.
This gets even harder when we take a look at our historical emissions. Some countries, namely the rich ones, are responsible for the vast majority of the greenhouse gases we've already put in the atmosphere.
The countries that industrialized first, like Japan and the US and Germany, are responsible for about half of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've put in the atmosphere. But they account for only about 1/6 of the world's population. So that's 1/2 to 1/6. Ugh, it's terrible.
Just to make one particularly stark comparison, if we look at all of the CO2 that's been released by the United States over the last 200 years and split it up evenly over the 310 million people that live in the US today, you find out that each of us today is responsible for about 800 tons of historical US emissions. In contrast, if we do the same calculation for, say, India, they're only responsible for about 32 tons per person historically. That means each person in the US is responsible for about 25 times as much historical CO2 as the average Indian.
Equity isn't just a moral or a philosophical problem, it's a practical problem. It's no coincidence that the rich countries are responsible for a bigger share of the greenhouse gas emissions.
It's partly our historical access to energy and use of fossil fuels that has made us wealthy.
But if the rest of the world developed like we did, then there's no chance of keeping global warming under control. And then basically we'd all be screwed.
So is it reasonable for us to expect a country like India to limit their citizens' access to energy? Especially when a lot of them don't have access to electricity. In India alone, there's about 300 million people, or the entire population of the US, that still don't have electricity at all. It seems especially crazy to ask them to do that if we in the rich world aren't willing to also get hard to work on reducing our own emissions.
These equity issues are at the root of why the international climate negotiations have been at a standstill, pretty much since they began.
Either we have to argue that it's somehow fair for us to have gotten to release a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions and the rest of the world never does, which really doesn't seem very fair, or we have to accept a greater responsibility for reducing our emissions early and fast.
Unsurprisingly, that's actually not at all what we're talking about in the rich countries.
There are infinitely expensive things at stake here, like a habitable planet.